Hello and welcome to IFG Live, looking at the use of evidence in government and parliament. And what a timely moment for this discussion with SAGE's latest analysis on the scientific evidence for a national lockdown at the heart of debates in the House over what the government should do next on coronavirus. But of course, at the Institute for Government, we've been interested in these debates about how evidence is used in policy making for many years, how it's used in government, in parliament, the different bodies that advise government, and the way in which academia engages with government. So today's discussion will not only cover the current headlines, but also some of the longer term problems that ministers, officials and MPs have faced in trying to use evidence well. What can be done about them? How can we improve this? So we're extremely grateful for the forum, Imperial College London, Imperial's policy engagement arm, for sponsoring today's event, as well as two private roundtables previously held, which looked at the use of evidence in both government and parliament. You can find a write-up on the webpage from those roundtables on the webpage for today's event, so do take a read of that. For those of you watching at home, thank you very much for joining us. Please do use the Q&A function that you can see on your screen. You can submit questions throughout the event. We will run through the panelists a bit first. I'll have a bit of a chat with them about some of these issues, but we'll try and weave in your questions from fairly early on. So please do add them as you think of them. The event is, of course, public. So on the record, the hashtag is IFG Evidence. And we've got an excellent panel here today joining us. The Right Honourable Greg Clark was Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy from July 2016 to July last year. Before that, he held several other junior ministerial and shadow posts, and he's currently chair of the Science and Technology Committee. He was elected Conservative MP for Royal Tunbridge Wells in 2005. And also delighted to be joined by Onwurah. She's Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital and has been MP for Newcastle upon Tyne Central since 2010. But before entering politics, she was herself a graduate of Imperial College. She's an engineer. She worked in hardware and software development and product management for companies in several countries. And also joining me today is Tom Sasse. He's a senior researcher at the Institute for Government. Tom is currently working on a project looking at the government's use of science advice during the coronavirus pandemic. So lots of interesting angles to talk about there. And his past projects have included reports recently out looking at the government's net zero ambitions and a series of reports looking at government outsourcing and on how government engages with academic expertise. Previously, Tom worked at the Open Data Institute and the Reform think tank. But before we start, I am extremely pleased to hand over to Mary Ryan. Mary is Professor of Materials Science and Nanotechnology and the Vice Dean Research in the Faculty of Engineering, Imperial College London. Mary, I'll turn to you just for some opening remarks before we get stuck in with the panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks to everyone for joining. So as Catherine said, I'm the Vice Dean for Research and Engineering at Imperial, and I'm also responsible for our strategic initiatives around sustainability. So this is the third and final event of this series that's been organised by the forum together with the Institute for Government, and it's been a really exciting partnership, and I'd just like to thank everyone at the Institute again for helping organise these events. I'd like to extend my thanks to the panellists here. We're very fortunate to have the two MPs that are joining us, probably the two, I would say, most scientifically literate and strong advocates for science and engineering evidence within Parliament. She is also, as you heard, an alumna from Imperial College, and in particular from the Faculty of Engineering, my home at Imperial. She's been a great friend to the college. So thank you both for giving up your time. We realise this is, an extraordinary time in government, and taking time to think about this really critical issue and share your thoughts with us. We're grateful for that. And thanks also to Tom for joining the panel as from the Institute for Government, which I think is going to add an extra dimension to some of the discussion. So at Imperial, as I'm sure you all know, we have great research. We have the highest concentration of high impact science of any university in the UK. But we also recognise that it's not at all trivial to turn that great research into effective evidence that policymakers can use. And so to that end, we launched the forum last year to try and reach out to policymakers to government to really enhance the communication between academics and people who have to try and understand that science, that evidence into policy. So we launched the forum last year with an event with Sir Patrick Vance, the Chief Scientific Advisor. And during that event, I was actually fortunate to hold an in-person Q&A with Sir Patrick, where we talked about the challenges that we face, and I think shared a viewpoint, and it was a very refreshing sharing of opinions, just understanding the importance of evidence use, but also the importance of the onus on us as academics to be able to make it easy for government to understand what we're doing, to enhance our communication and to make the translation of our research much easier for policy. So the forum is about bringing academics and policymakers together to learn from each other. For effective policymaking, we know it's critical that the country's leading researchers understand what the questions and the issues that policymakers are facing are. And to that end, we need them to tell us and to be able to talk to us so we can really start to try and answer those. It's similarly crucial that policymakers have easy access to science that underpins the policies they're working on and scrutinising, and the forum really wants to make these relationships. In my role at Imperial, I've also just launched a new initiative called the Transition to Zero Pollution, and this is an activity initiative where we want to try and take a systems-based approach to tackling anthropogenic pollution in all its forms. It will bring together researchers across Imperial, science, engineering, clinicians, economists and behavioural scientists to think about these challenges collaboratively, but also to reach beyond Imperial to engage with government and industry. It's an ambitious initiative, and we know we're going to need to be working with policymakers in government and parliament to realise the goals for a better future. I'm sure you're all aware to address the challenge of climate change and go beyond carbon is going to require ambitious science, innovative technology, but also really bold policymaking, and we want to make sure that that's done in partnership. So that's why I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing the thoughts of our panelists on the best ways that we as an academic institution can improve our communication with government and the way that using evidence can improve policy making together. So thank you, and I'm going to hand back over to you, Kath, and I look forward to hearing the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mary. Lots of food for thought to get us started. Greg, I'd like to turn to you first and to give us the perspective from government. Mary's talked a lot there about the access that academia can help provide in terms of giving evidence into government. We talk a lot about the supply of evidence into government as well as the demand. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that demand in government. How impressed were you by the way in which evidence was used when you were a minister, and how much of a thirst is there within government to be using it and to be using it well?
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for inviting me. Perhaps I could just say to Mary, I mean, Imperial's been a case study in the value of direct communication of science throughout this pandemic. So many people across the country have become familiar with many of the experts in Imperial and of course other colleges, institutes and universities, and it's done a real service. And I think one of the big delights for me in the way that science has been prominent in this pandemic is that lots of people who previously didn't have the chance to see scientific evidence have seen it and have been engaged in it, and Imperial's been at the forefront of that. So it's very appropriate that Mary's introducing the session today. But in government, I think there is a strong, there's certainly a strong availability of people within the civil service who are able to contribute evidence, whether research done within government or drawing on external perspectives. In terms of the appetite for that, frankly, I think it probably depends on the minister. I was always very keen on that, but you might expect that, being sort of social sciences by background. Other ministers perhaps approach things more with their kind of feel for what was the right thing to do based on their sort of political intuition, and the governments are politically led, and that's an important role. But I certainly felt well supported. I suppose a couple of things I would say. One is, one of my bugbears in all the departments that I worked in as a minister was that there was a sense in which the analysts, as they were called, were somehow a kind of separate team, and often were a separate team that had to be sort of referred out to, and then they would submit something back into the policy line. I was totally mystified by that. I didn't understand how anyone could think about policy without thinking of themselves as an analyst. And I was sort of critical of the idea that this should be a separate function, contracted out, and not really part of the mainstream. And I guess, and I think the pandemic has been an illustration of this. But one of the challenges in being totally evidence-based is sometimes evidence is not available at a time when a decision needs to be made. And the early stages of the pandemic is a good case in point there. And if you insist on only doing things where there is a strong evidence base, you may not do things until it's too late. And actually, there is a sense in which making judgments, sometimes in advance of evidence being available, is very important. So this can't be too mechanistic, in my view.
Thanks, Greg. Some very interesting points there, especially that one, I think, at the end about waiting for the total picture to arrive. I mean, certainly through coronavirus, that's been a real theme in governments, the lack of evidence, even in the earliest stages, to understanding this novel coronavirus and trying to get to grips with that. Chi, I want to turn to you, because obviously if that's a problem for governments, in theory, that's an even greater problem for MPs who don't have access to the civil service. They do have access to various support mechanisms within Parliament, whether it's the libraries, post the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, their own researchers and so forth. How well supported do you think that MPs generally are, but particularly shadow ministers, in finding and using evidence in Parliament, especially compared to government? I mean, we'll get on to perhaps some of the COVID specific problems in a minute, but generally, how well?
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and just let me echo also Greg's admiration and compliments to Imperial College, as well as the Institute for Government, and thanks for inviting me here today. And this is such an important issue, which is why I was really keen to take part. And let me start by, without doing ourselves down, if you like. I mean, I do believe that shadow ministers, and we have, it's a great system in the UK. I think if you look at France and America, the US and others, we have a shadow government. We have shadow ministers. So it's like which is sort of one-to-one marking. And Greg and I have faced off across the dispatch box in the past many times, and it's been very interesting, and I think an important part of our democracy, that testing and scrutiny. As a shadow minister, the support that I have is what you mentioned there. I mean, I have a researcher. I have one full-time paid researcher, but frankly, researchers are very rare to find researchers with a scientific background, and it's not why most people go into researchers. And I actually have tried advertising my research posts on Imperial's notice boards without very much response. So this is an advert for the future in that respect. But also, I think because scientific and engineering researchers will go into research, and so that there's that challenge. And the House of Commons Library, and if there's anybody here who's watching this from the House of Commons Library, is fantastic, and that provides excellent support, and it's also very very accessible. We've got the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology as well. But where I think that part of the challenge lies is in framing the right questions, and also in scrutinizing what is being presented as evidence by the government, because with a sort of whole department full of civil servants, I think Greg would agree, I hope you agree, that what is presented as evidence is not necessarily politically neutral. And so one of the ways in which I can test ideas and policies is by asking parliamentary questions. But the responses that come back to parliamentary questions, will not include or will not generally actually won't actually answer the question that I'm asking. And I do feel there is a real need for some kind of intermediate or independent kind political or governmental evidence verification or summary or summarising or something, because I think right now there is a really sort of big gap. It's being interestingly filled to a certain extent by the full fact-checking organisations who are now going through every parliamentary PMQs and every appearance by ministers. And I think that points to the fact that there is I think in Greg's said there's lots of sort of evidence out there, but to find effective communication of evidence, with all its failings is really is very difficult. And I think particularly, thing I would say also is that members of parliament, I think, really also do need to have access to some sort of statistical training, because I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, degree and a master's, but I think what has been the most sort of useful to me is actually an understanding and familiarity of the use of figures, because there's a lot of evidence, and I'll put inverted commas around it, out there, but being able to test that evidence and to have it scrutinized and verified is the real challenge. And I sort of philosophically, is it evidence if it isn't required to be scrutinized and challenged? I don't know, but we need some kind of intermediate verification or maybe credentials, maybe a kite mark. This evidence is real evidence, to help, I think, in the process of opposition and scrutiny.
Thanks, Chi. Tom, I'll turn to you. I mean, give us a sense of the discussions thus far in the roundtables. How much did you get into these questions? And also, I mean, Chi's already given us a few ideas there of, potential structural changes, some of which, we've been discussing for years. But how much did you get into what might improve things, what might actually take us and move us on a level? Just give us a sense of it.
Yeah, so I think Chi's hit on a really interesting point at the end there around what do we define as evidence. And I think the definition is pretty different in academia, where you'd think of sort of peer-reviewed papers, as it is in sort of government and parliament, where actually evidence might be sort of previous select committee reports or government policy papers or things like that. So I think that's sort of one of the things about different understandings. In terms of what we heard, I'd echo a lot of the points Greg and Chi have already made, really. I think both, officials in departments or clerks on select committees or researchers for MPs, they're all very busy people, and it's difficult for all of those people to know where to find evidence. That's the first barrier. A lot of times they're sort of generalists. They might not have a deep background in the area where they're looking for evidence, and they might not have connections into academia. Often they're just using Google as a sort of way to try and find someone particularly relevant. So I think the one thing we often say to academics is the more you can make yourselves findable, the better. I think there's then the sort of challenge of using evidence well. And, I definitely recognise the point that Greg made about analysts within government departments. Actually, in the Home Office, when we looked at that a couple of years ago, the analysts and the policy officials were on an entirely separate floor. So they definitely felt very disconnected from that sort of policy discussion happening with ministers. And I think that's a real shame. You really actually want ministers to be making sure that analytical expertise, who tend to have that better understanding of the evidence, is included. For analysts, there is then that challenge of making sure they're able to kind of communicate in a way that ministers want to sort of hear and don't sort of get excluded from those conversations. I think there's a similar thing in Parliament about using evidence persuasively and making sure it gets heard. One of the really interesting bits of sort of testimony we heard was from Dame Diana Johnson, who led the campaign on contaminated blood. And she talked about the need for both to combine a kind of really rigorous evidence base and understanding of kind of, the impact of this scandal, the numbers, the science behind it, but also with some very personal stories about who had been affected in order to get other members to sort of stand up and listen, as it were. In terms of the solutions, I think there's various things around how to institutionalize this better. Some of the things like secondments, the role of these institutions like Post, evidence institutions outside of government can all help. Committees like the Committee on Climate Change that sit slightly externally have been seen as a real benefit. The other thing I would highlight, and I think this really comes out of the current crisis, is an understanding of the role of evidence and a sort of literacy around evidence, both for ministers and for officials and for MPs in Parliament. I mean, we can see that in the kind of initial part of this crisis. We remember the kind of line about following the science, which wasn't really a particularly accurate reflection of the role of sort of evidence in feeding into policy making. But I think there's also something about ministers being able to just understand enough of sort of scientific language and scientific ways of communicating such that they're able to challenge it, to sort of digest that evidence and use it effectively. And the same is true for officials and MPs.
Thanks, Tom. I want to just delve into this question about select committees. One or two of the questioners watching have already sort of put aspects of that. And Greg, obviously, you've gone from being a Secretary of State to a chair of a select committee. So on one level, a massive reduction in resources, but obviously you're able to request anyone from government to come in and give evidence to you and probe some of these questions. How difficult is it to get yourself up to speed and effectively go toe to toe with ministers and senior officials in terms of exploring some of these questions about science and technology, particularly in COVID, particularly when in the early stages, so little was known about what was going on?
Well, good question, Kath. And as you say, leaving government, having been 9 years a minister, I got used to a certain level of advice and support, and was kind of braced for it being kind of much diminished in taking on the chair of the select committee. But actually, I've been amazed and delighted at the level of support that there is. I mean, she mentioned the House of Commons Library, and that's very important, and the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. But if I think the committee clerks, certainly the clerks on my committee, are incredibly skilled at identifying the most important sources of evidence to inform an inquiry. We do have specialist advisors who come in for a kind of tour of duty in the committee office. And then coupled with that, and curious enough, the constraints of the pandemic in terms of not taking most evidence in person, but over Zoom, has meant that we've basically had available to us, certainly on COVID and other inquiries, anyone around the world that we cared to invite. In other words, the top experts, and without exception, in my experience, they've been willing to testify. And if you're on the west coast of the United States, you can do it in an hour Zoom call, whereas it would be virtually impossible to kind of come over to London and spend days to give the same hour's evidence. So I've felt that we've been well informed, and we've had pretty good cooperation from government agencies and departments. We did have a bit of a standoff with Public Health England for a time when we wanted to see, it's a kind of case in point, we wanted to know why the strategy of testing that had been adopted here was not, as we thought, learning the lessons from countries like South Korea and Hong Kong and others. And so we asked whether a comparative study had been made of testing, and we were told that it had been, and that this would be supplied to us, but it never was. And so I wouldn't say that's more exceptional than typical. But for the most part, I feel that we've had access to information and analysis that's, frankly, at least as good as I had access to in government.
That's very interesting. Actually, I'd almost want to ask whether it feels the same from the point of view of the shadow cabinet in terms of getting access from government about things that you need to know about. But I've got a load of questions coming at me, so I need to also ask you some of those. And there has been a couple of questions which have been about the opposition's access to the civil service and whether or not you know, a change in the system could work around that. I mean, you are able to write questions to the government, but obviously there's this big gap, certainly in this country, between the civil service serving the government of the day and what you get access to. You know, how much does that affect? Is it ever something that you wish that you talked about having an independent organisation? Do you think that just greater ability to inquire of the civil service, get information out of them would make a difference?
Yes, I think what we need, you know, and I think sort of an independent sort of verification is not. I'm not. The civil service, our civil service is excellent, and it's not. It is in principle and non-political and non-biased. And I think that is very important. But I do think greater sort of access and also. I mean, I know there are many standards for civil service behaviour, but in the context of evidence, and just let me give you an example. So I was one of those northeastern MPs, and now we know that this morning northwestern MPs, etc., are having briefings from government on local COVID measures. And the evidence that we were presented with, and one example of the evidence we were presented with, was that the transmission was happening in hospitality. And that, as evidence for that, I was told that 15% of recent exposures, no, 25% of recent exposures had been within hospitality, and that there was a US study which showed that hospitality was the most recent likely vector. Now, when I tried to test those figures, I couldn't get any underlying evidence. And if you have 25% of exposure is in hospitality, we're also told that 70% of exposure is within the home. That leaves no exposure in universities and schools, virtually, for example. And the US study was a very small sample from the Centre for Disease Control. So what I would have liked to have was some kind of sort of, I don't know, requirement that evidence had already been tested before being put to us as you know, as opposition and other members of Parliament, rather than I had the impression that it was being used to support a policy that was already in existence. Now, so I think that there needs to be, and you know, much clearer support for the kind of engagement with not with MPs generally, whether in the government or not, but with MPs in terms of evidence. I just also want to add that some ministers, you know, and Greg is a great example of that, do offer up their civil servants, you know, to for sort of discussions with shadow ministers, and that is also very helpful. But that is a kind of like ad hoc, you know. There's no sort of as a shadow minister, one doesn't seem to have any sort of right to that. And I do think that now, as evidence has become more and more important, if you like, and we want a more evidence-based policy, as Tom talked about, it would be good to have clearer guidance on that, clearer or sort of minimum standards.
Tom.
It's a great point, and it's one that came up in our roundtables actually, which was around who owns responsibility within a department for how evidence is used, and actually ensuring that evidence is used at a sort of certain threshold and a certain standard. I mean, as Chi's saying, you know, and Greg said, you know, if you have a department run by someone like Greg who sort of cares about high standards and drives that, that's the incentives that officials get all the way through. If you don't, and I think it's actually in the civil service, you need a bit more of a clear ownership about who's going to make sure that the policy outputs are actually using evidence up to a rigorous standard. And what we found was that is not really happening. There's you know, it could fall on the permanent secretary, it could fall on the chief analyst, the chief scientist. They've got these heads of the policy profession in each department. In practice, it sort of falls between the cracks of all of those roles. And then I think you get examples like Chi just gave of evidence being used more in a sort of press release type way to support a particular argument, but not actually in a robust way. Who's checking that study? Who's testing the kind of, you know, what standard of evidence that is and how much it backs up the argument they're making. So I think that's a really important area for civil service reform, which of course, I mean, Michael Gove talked about the use of evidence in his Ditchley lecture, and I think it's something, that ownership of evidence is something we'd really like to see.
Thanks, Tom. I want to just probe a question that's quite topical at the moment, which is the sort of the independence of those advising government. Because, you know, I mean, Greg, you talked at the beginning, obviously, about the degree to which, you know, politicians had to think of values, they had to think of sort of the political backdrop to everything. And certainly, you know, the civil service in preparing material also have to consider that. But there's a question about how much some evidence can be independent of that. I just want to read out a few of the questions just so that we are covering them off. Somebody who is anonymous to reduce the information. No, sorry, that one was about access to the civil service. So another question was about using impact assessments and how much those are seen as politically neutral. That was from Stephen Gibson. We've also had a question from Malcolm Harbour, who's the former chair of the European Parliament's Internal Market Committee, about using impact assessments before legislative proposals and making sure that there was an independent assessment beforehand. How important is independence in all of this, of the information that you're getting? And is there a tension there? I mean, feel free to talk about SAGE and its role and how close it is to government and whether or not that gives it sufficient independence from government or whether there's some tensions there.
Well, on SAGE specifically, one of the things that we started out with the pandemic was not knowing the membership of SAGE, not knowing what their conclusions were, not knowing the evidence that they'd taken into account. And that's the division bell, if anyone's worried. It's not a fire alarm. It's the start of proceedings for comments. And one of the things that the committee, my committee, was critical of was that lack of transparency, especially because we thought that it was out of kilter with the norms and standards that pertain in science, where the essence of scientific progress is through transparency, through challenge, through publication. And often through debates that are every bit as vigorous as political debates. And so it proved that when actually Patrick Vallance and others agreed to publish all of these things, it turned out that the people that were on SAGE were extremely eminent and reputable people. There was no problem with that. And when the minutes of the meetings were published and the papers on which they'd based their advice, there were a lot of them. They were profuse and they were serious. And actually, I think that transparency built confidence. But SAGE is independent. All of the people there are, in my experience, kind of robustly independent. Many of them have appeared before the committee. There's sometimes been an insinuation that people that are on SAGE but on the public payroll are somehow compromised. That's not my view, and people like Patrick Vallance and Chris Switty, for example, they may be at the moment employees of the state, but their whole reputations and their whole standing is based entirely on their history of independent judgment. That the idea that would be suborned during their period of government service, I think is not something that anyone that knows them would recognise. But just on this point of support for the opposition and MPs in general, I was director of policy for the party in opposition from 2001 to 2005, and then from 2005 to 10, most of that time I was a shadow minister. So I've been through what she was describing in large parts. But I think it would be wrong to change the constitution of the civil service to make it work for opposition as well as government. The truth is that there are lots of sources of advice, and lots of the advice that one gets from the civil service is drawn from institutions such as the Institute for Government, from academics, from think tanks, and and then is drawn together by officials, but a lot of it is available to people that are interested generally. And one of the things that came in was a grant for opposition parties and indeed government parties, the policy development grant, that was to allow a greater capacity for perhaps deeper based policy development than was previously there. So I think that it's important that we should do that. Sorry, Kath, shall I just comment on the impact assessments?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
So I think there's a problem with this. In my experience, in lots of different departments in government, is that the impact assessments are required to be laid before Parliament, often when a bill is tabled, and they are, in my experience, things that sort of follow as a kind of compliance requirement, rather than something that is helping the development of policy. And I think if we are to continue with them, I think there should be a kind of reconsideration of how they can best inform the development of policy. Because I think most of my colleagues would say at the moment the things that are done towards the end rather than are really helpful in the development of policy.
Thank you, Chi. I've got two great questions here that are, obviously quite timely in a week where we're discussing the use of SAGE as evidence and the additional information that the government is basing its current lockdown decisions on. So one question from Rob Davies asks, should government ministers be made to cite the evidence and/or research used to support justified policy statements in their official speeches? But there's another great question from somebody who's anonymous saying, how do we balance the conversation about evidence-based policy to recognise that it is legitimate for politicians to take decisions for ideological or other policy reasons, while also urging more extensive and intelligent use of the research? Can we get away from the binary of evidence-based or not? What's your take on that at the moment?
Well, those are two great questions, and I think it's good practice always to cite the research and the evidence base for decisions which are made. And I think certainly in general, where ministers don't cite that, there will be follow-up parliamentary questions or queries in order to get at that. And I think we've also seen often that that at times research and evidence that is cited is either partially relevant, or is shall we say misremembered. And so I think that's good practice. I'm not sure whether you could sort of enshrine that in a requirement. And I do also want to say that, like Greg, I'm not seeking to have the civil service constitution rewritten, but I am seeking, I think, as the civil service and all institutions involved, the role of evidence needs to be better integrated in best practice and guidelines. Now, as to the second question, which was sorry, what was the second question?
It was about whether we can get away from the binary of seeing it as purely evidence-based and recognize.
I think that's a fantastic point. And I should say, I spent 6 years working for Ofcom, the Office of Communications, as developing technology, telecoms policy, and producing the evidence to justify that. And I think that the point that there is evidence, there is scientific evidence, but there is also the will of the people, if you like, which we are here in Parliament to represent, and the people are sovereign, and as we have seen that the decisions that may be taking on the basis of democratic mandate may not necessarily match the scientific, or because it's not only scientific, well, science covers economics and human and the humanities as well, so it might not match the evidence as to where that our greatest well-being is. So I think it is really important that we recognize that, and I'm not one to quote Margaret Thatcher, but scientists advise, politicians decide. But I also think that sort of that division is not been clear. And I would also say, that in the early days, particularly of the crisis, I think the scientists were outmaneuvered by the politicians. I think when politicians, some of our leading politicians were saying that they were following the science, what they were often doing was leaning on the science to justify not taking difficult decisions, and having, as Greg said, two such eminent scientists who I agree, whose reputation in the science I am sure is more important to them than the color of the party in government at the moment. But they were kind of there as sort of as iconic symbols of scientific robustness, which was not necessarily part of what the actual politician at the front was saying. And so I think having a kind of clearer understanding and communication of those kinds of lines between evidence and politics, it's important. And I think that we see from the release of the minutes from the last SAGE meeting, which advocated a circuit breaker, I think the scientists are becoming more, shall we say, aware of this, more aware of this.
Can I just come in on that, Catherine?
Yeah.
So I don't agree with Chi's characterization of the role of the scientists at the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, the evidence that we took on my committee, and we wrote a letter to the government on this, was that we felt that all of the evidence we took in that first phase was that the government had genuinely wanted to take scientific advice, had kind of convened a structure through SAGE that contained a good distillation of the best expertise, and that had followed that advice. We were told there was no material respect, this is in the first phase, in which the government had not followed the advice that had been put to it through SAGE. But I think what became apparent was I think they were perfectly good and high-minded reasons to reflect on the fact that we've got some brilliant scientists in this country. Of course, we ought to be guided by that. But actually, I think there were a couple of problems that emerged. One was this point of timing that I mentioned. If you're going to take a completely scientific approach to it, sometimes rigorous science will have to wait for the evidence on which to advise. And in the early stages, there wasn't much of that evidence. You need to gather it, you then need to analyze it, and then you need to formulate conclusions. And I think that led to a gap that countries that didn't make such a high profile commitment of following the science were able to make more pragmatic policy decisions, often in anticipation of the evidence, a judgment, that we should lock down because we think that would be a good precaution, rather than waiting for this to be absolutely proved that this is necessary. The use of face masks, for example, there was quite a lot of toing and froing as to whether the evidence said that they were effective or not. Other countries seem to be able to be free to make pragmatic policy decisions by not being tied so closely to that. And the other aspect is, and this week's SAGE minutes that were published make reference to this, that there is the epidemiological evidence, and SAGE has many epidemiologists on it, and others in related disciplines. But there are other considerations, such as the wider impact on the healthcare system, on the economy, and the implications of that for health and well-being. And I think to have that breadth of perspective and evidence, sometimes I think you need to get back to the core role of political leaders of making judgments informed by evidence, but judgments that they themselves are making and are accountable.
Sorry, can I just say, Greg, I think I mean, I recognise the points you're making, and I agree partially, I'd say, with them. But I think the point I was making was that there was not, certainly in the early days of the pandemic, and as you have said, we did not even know who was on the SAGE committee initially. There was not a robust representation of the fact that there was debates behind the science that was being followed. You know, that there wasn't one science. I mean, I know sometimes the Prime Minister, I think, said the science has changed, like, the debates evolved, and that was not robustly that was not represented in the press briefings, whilst at the same time having such eminent scientists gave it credibility, which without an explicit debate meant that it seemed to be, I think, more scientific rather than political, because there's always a political representation.
Well, Chi makes an important point, and I think one of the things that the public have come to see is that there are lots of different perspectives in the scientific community, and again, one of the privileges of being able to chair a select committee where you have, over a couple of hours, the ability to call different witnesses, you can bring to light those different perspectives, and I think people have recognised that the science is very rarely there's very rarely a kind of single view on that, and there's been an interest in that. But we did probe Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty and others on this, of whether this diversity of views of scientists was properly reflected, and they both made an interesting and I think important point, which was that yes, of course there were these views, and SAGE considered them deeply and properly. But in terms of providing advice to government, if it was to be useful, the chairs of SAGE said that they felt the need to be able to distill it into as much of a kind of consensus recommendation as possible, rather than simply just to reflect back to government, well, we've looked at this and there are 10 different views and here's what they are, it's over to you. So it was, and I think it was a responsible ambition that the leadership of SAGE had, which is not just to gather and to reflect to government the range of scientific opinion, but actually to distill it into a set of recommendations, even knowing that they would not necessarily be the views of everyone that was part of the discussion, still less that had submitted evidence.
Thanks. And just before, Tom, I will bring you in on all of this because I know you're very interested in it, but just to make sure that they've been heard, I want to give a shout out to various people who've been raising some of these issues about diversity. Stephen Meek has been talking about the University Policy Engagement Network, UPenn. There are a number of these organisations out there that are trying to improve the networks that get access to academics, but it's been a theme throughout talking about the way in which academics can engage with government and select committees, that there is often a lack of diversity there. And that's not just about, as we've seen with SAGE, this question of should there have been more public health experts there, should there have been different disciplines there. Obviously, there's also a greater tendency towards, as we know, much more likely to be male, white, London-based researchers who get better access into engagement, and how that affects the evidence is a huge fact. Chris Sims has also asked about that. There is other people, and apologies if I'm not getting through all of the questions. Pip has also asked about diversity of witnesses in select committees, and another great question asked about, I'm just trying to find it now, about being able to have experts sitting on select committees, so you're not just interviewing experts, you're actually getting experts able to probe the ministers and civil servants and so forth, and what difference would that make? Go on, Chief. Yes.
Okay, can I just say a word about diversity, because it's and in some ways, I'm glad, to put this in inverted commas, that the pandemic means that people, experts and scientists from the northeast may actually get to give evidence on select committees like Greg's, as in the past, and they have been, and either because they haven't been asked to, or because travel expenses have not been paid, for example. And I do think that the diversity, when you talk, Catherine, also about the diversity of voices in backgrounds, which has an impact, because when Greg talks about having to distill the evidence, that process of distillation is not a scientific process based on the temperature. You know, it is a process which depends on who's in the room and what their perspectives are, and what the potential for groupthink. And so I suppose what I'm, you know, one of the things, and I don't know whether this is part of your debates that you've been having, but what I would like to see is not that scientists and those who give evidence say, oh, on the one hand, on the other hand, and you end up with a mass from which politicians cannot make decisions, but that perhaps you have some kind of standards for effectively caveating this. You know, say this evidence was selected from a you know, some guide, best practice, and also standards, so that evidence can be seen in context, because there is always a context for evidence, and I feel that is not what has not come through.
Tom.
So I think one useful thing would be to draw a distinction between SAGE's advice to government and then the underlying evidence that supports that advice. I think Greg's right that there's quite a kind of noble sort of historic reasons why SAGE wants to provide a sort of its summary judgment of the evidence. We've heard stories from sort of John Major's time during BSc of having sort of 2 or 3 different scientists you know, arguing completely different points of view in front of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister saying, well, I just have no idea what to do with all of that. So SAGE was partly set up for that purpose, to provide a consensus view. However, I think, you know, if it's just the minutes that are being published, what you don't get, and the sort of people in the wider community and the public in sort of schools or wherever it is, what they don't get is a sense of what the evidence says and the underlying evidence base. So actually government and SAGE could be publishing that much more proactively. One of the things we saw with the debate over school closures and when they should reopen was actually a lot of teachers and the unions were sceptical of the way government was communicating about the evidence, and some of the SAGE minutes actually bear some of that out. A lot of scientists had doubts and concerns about exactly how safe that was and what the impact on teachers might be. So I think publishing more of the evidence to try and generate a bit more you know, common understanding would be quite useful. But I totally agree with Greg's point about the advice. I just wanted to throw one other thing in there, just about the very difficult role that scientific advisors are playing, and this sort of comes onto the point of independence. I think, you know, there's this useful term that Roger Pielke, an American academic, has developed around an honest broker being the kind of most difficult thing to attain, in terms of neutrally just opening up the options and giving sort of context around the evidence of different choices. I think scientific advisors do get pulled into a very political realm, and you've seen quite different approaches to dealing with that. People like David King, John Beddington were perhaps more in the kind of independent challenger, be able to sort of speak their mind openly. People like Mark Walport, Patrick Vallance were maybe played that role as more of a kind of confidant and wanted to sort of be slightly closer and have a bit more influence and impact. I think both are completely legitimate ways to approach that role, but it's a difficult and nuanced role to get right, and I think there are difficult choices for scientists.
We've not got much time left, so I just want to throw in a few questions that have been posed here. There's been a number of people who've been asking about, you know, given we're talking about academics, evidence, science and so forth, been asking about, could there be more done to include, say, footnotes or, you know, communicating evidence? And actually Natalie Bennett, the Green member from the Lords, has talked about trying to get footnotes into Hansard, but Rob Davies has also brought that. Rebecca Hill has asked about communicating uncertainty, and actually there's another great question here which has talked about communicating this stuff to the public in particular and helping the public understand better use of evidence. And then there's also been a few questions which have talked a bit about, is there more that you can do for training? So Abby Hobbs, who works at Post, has asked about what more we can do to support training for members, staff, parliamentary staff, and I will find it if I can, but somebody else, Chi, referenced your mention earlier about statistical understanding and said, is there more that needs to be done to help them with cost benefit? So to both of you, I guess, is a question about, do you think your colleagues in the House of Commons would welcome training to sort of think about it, or is that something that starts to get sort of tricky in terms of the role of MPs and coming in as sort of experts appointed, or rather coming in as people, as representatives of their communities? Chi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy. I'll leave the last word to Greg on this, but I think that's a really, really important point. And I'll say that, you know, I worked in tech in industry for 23 years before coming into Parliament. MP is the only job where I have not had a personal development plan and a training plan and a performance assessment, if you like, around skills and development outside of clearly an election every well, depending on the timetable for that. So I do think training needs to be more available and also more promoted. We've talked about, certainly in the Labour Party, a kind of HR function for MPs, which doesn't exist at the moment. And I do think that, I mean, obviously we've seen with the unconscious bias training that there are barriers to members of Parliament accepting training. And I think that to some members of Parliament, and I think that goes to part of the issue here. So members of Parliament are supposed to be representatives of the people, and so we do not want, we should not be trying to make members of Parliament into accomplished statisticians, scientists, or engineers. But we need more generally as a society. And if you look at the way in which misinformation is spreading, if you look at the changes in the spread of information across our society in the last 20 years, then there needs to be a response from Parliament and from our democratic system. And that response should be the way in which evidence is formed, the training that is available and promoted to members of Parliament. And I do think statistics and a familiarity with numbers and figures, means, is important. But also more generally, there needs to be an increase in sort of education and understanding generally on information, misinformation, evidence, because that is the only way, given the changes in the spread of misinformation in particularly, and the challenges that we face, that is the only way for Parliament and our political discourse to evolve in a progressive and positive direction.
Thank you. Greg, final thoughts from you.
So I very much agree with what she said about statistics. I think people are becoming more interested. I think the public's becoming more interested in statistics, and to make some training or some briefing available, I think would be very good. I think you can't force people to take it. If I think of the budget briefings that the Institute for Fiscal Studies makes available at every fiscal event, they call it every budget and every autumn statement, they are very well attended, and as you know, they're very expert and rigorous, and there's a big appetite for that. People go to be able to understand that analysis, and so I think that would be good to do. People like Tim Harford are enjoying great success and doing great public service, in my view, in helping people think through statistics, and might be something that the Royal Statistical Society or one of the academies could make available to members of Parliament. In answer to your point, Catherine, about how you can convey the diversity of opinion and sort of guide people through it, I think we have to rely on transparency for that. I think we should follow the scientific method and have a default to publication and allow the increasingly available sort of multiple sources of scrutiny to pull claims apart if they don't stand up rigorously. And there is an increasing ability to do that. And I think that should be our default, that evidence is put out there for people to scrutinize. But I guess kind of finally, and perhaps kind of provocatively, given the subject, I very much, and you know, I've always been interested in the use of evidence and analysis in policy making. It's one of the things that made me interested in policy, how you can turn the facts that you can discover into policy. So it's always important to do that. But that's easy for everyone to accept. It's obvious that, you know, should evidence inform policy making? Yes, of course, that's a no-brainer, and maximising the opportunities to do that is clear. I think the bigger challenge, the more difficult challenge, is the other way around, and whether it's a challenge to the institutional government or academic groups and others, which is how those people that are engaged in the analysis of evidence and the collection of evidence can recognise the fact that in our democratic system, the public can choose policies that they then expect to be adopted that haven't come through a formal and rigorous process of policy development. You know, part of politics is trying to discern what people want, and governments, especially at the beginning of their terms, are obliged to give expression to that. And so, you know, improving the ability of governments and policymakers to act on evidence, I think, is very important, and great work is being done on that. But actually, I think the ability to understand how, when the public express themselves as wanting something, that can be accommodated, and that can be helped by institutions outside Parliament. That's more challenging, but I think is something that we ought collectively to think about.
Thank you, Greg. Very interesting thought for us to end on, and I wish we had more time to be able to discuss all of this. But apologies to everyone watching whose questions I've not got to, but in the spirit of today's conversation, just because I haven't referenced you does not mean that your evidence and analysis has not influenced this event. I've been reading them throughout, and there's lots of really interesting food for thought for us to take away there. And certainly to take it away, we will do so. As Tom has mentioned, we are working on something looking at scientific advice during coronavirus, so watch that space. Also working with Sense About Science, thinking, as Greg mentioned just now, about the transparency of evidence and how government shows its workings in terms of the policy choices and how it's implementing them. And again, going back to the point he's just made, how that interacts with the public's perception of them, what the government had promised the public in their manifestos and so forth. But just to say huge thanks yet again to my panel today, to Greg Clark, Onwurah, Tom Sasse. Thanks again to the Forum Imperial College for supporting today's events and the workshops that preceded them. Do take a look at the write-up. This is obviously a topic we're going to keep coming back to again and again during COVID and beyond. Hopefully we will make progress with some of these issues. There's a lot of people who are really interested in it, really keen to improve it. And thank you all very much for watching. Bye-bye.